Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Inside the Psychopathic Mind podcast. Again, Jason Smith with Carl Giacono. How are you today, Carl?
Yeah, Jason, hanging in there. Glad to have Michael with us today.
Yes. And Michael S. is back again. Again, he's the clinical psychologist from Denmark. And today he's going to talk about a kind of different kind of population, a country we might not necessarily hear of, but Greenland. He's going to talk about some of the sex offenders, and Michael is kind of working on an article where me and Carl are kind of part of it, looking at comparing his sample of Greenland sex offenders to a U.S. population. But I'll throw it to Carl first to give us a little start, and then Michael, again, thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Michael, there's so many typologies and different groupings for sex offenders, and even if you get into child molesters. But one of the things that's kind of useful, because they are different, would be organizing the discussion around the idea of regressed child molesters versus fixated ones, with the fixated ones being, of course, more like pedophiles that are actively interested in children as their primary source of sexual gratification, where people that sometimes molest children outside of the pedophiles may do it for many different reasons.
Yeah, I completely agree. And again, thanks for having me back. I had a great time last time. So let's talk a little bit about Greenland. And obviously, Greenland is a hot topic in many ways in the world right now. But we're not going to get into the whole politics. But as you know, I lived there for a couple of years and I worked on a specific sex offender project that actually had the kind of aim to get child molesters. And I use that term exactly because what you said, Carl, is that they're not necessarily pedophiles, that to get them to go into treatment and to keep them from reoffending. So that was kind of the project. And I assessed them, also risk assessed them, and tried to find out if they were motivated to go into treatment. And I did this among other instruments with the Rorschach. So that's what the article is going to be about. And I think the first point I really want to make is exactly the one that you say, Carl, that they are not, even though Greenland has actually a very, very sad world record in the sense that they have the highest prevalence of child molesting in the world per capita. It doesn't mean that there are more pedophiles in Greenland, and that's very important to note for several reasons, both for diagnostic reasons, but also in the sense that there's probably a little bit more hope of kind of treating these people when they're not fixated in their sexuality.
What percentage, roughly, not the exact figure, but in the people you evaluate and such, what percentage were actually pedophiles versus just child molesters?
Well, I think in the sample, I have maybe 25 offenders, and I think a couple. I mean, so what are we down to? One or two that I would consider actual pedophiles. So I'm not the sharpest in percentage math here, but
yes.
So not a lot.
10%, yeah.
Yeah.
And as you talk about your sample, which I know you're going to describe, Michael, why is it more difficult, do you think, to treat pedophiles than just like a regressed child molester?
Yeah, well, obviously, the thing that you have to treat then is the sexuality, and that is a difficult thing to treat. Obviously, if we go back in history, that at one time homosexuality was considered to be a perversion, and people tried to treat that, and they found out that it's not a very easy thing to manipulate or change people's sexuality. Fortunately, now we don't consider that a perversion anymore or a paraphilia. But if we get to the pedophilia, I think that the point is the same, that you cannot really change people's sexuality. You can obviously work around it and try to create barriers for them not to offend, for example, but you cannot treat the actual problem. But if the problems are more social problems, personality problems, substance abuse problems, then that's, I think, easier to treat because we have all these kind of instruments and treatments for that.
So in the regressed offenders, those other factors become more important. With someone that's a pedophile, that's their primary source of sexual gratification, there's a lot of things that go into shaping and developing that behavior. And it's very difficult to change. I remember in the old days, working in a sexual behavior lab with Dr. Richard Laws, and they did things like orgasmic reconditioning and aversive conditioning, where on a basic kind of behavioral level, they would attempt to change some of those arousal patterns. But that's much more difficult, I imagine, than a regressed offender who may also have sexual relationships with adults and really does it or did it because of the circumstances.
Because what you described there kind of give you a reminiscence of Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, where they try to kind of change the way he feels about violence. It's just in his nature. So I think it's difficult, and in Denmark, also coming in Greenland, but that's a whole different story. We use a lot of these anti-androgenous drugs for the real pedophiles. So we kind of remove the testosterone. Medical castration is what it's called actually, and that's, I think, the only way to really effectively treat the true pedophiles. But as I said, in Greenland, that's not exactly the case. So the interesting thing there is that there was a treatment program where you could sort of refer them to, and they actually had Greenlandic speaking psychologists, which was a really big thing because there are not a lot of those in Greenland. So they would try to have a more holistic approach to kind of treat these people for the different kind of problems that they had that might result in the sexual offending.
Well, tell us about what these people look like, their personality characteristics, what you find, which will lead into the type of treatment that you probably would do with them.
Yeah. Typically, I would say less antisocial than a lot of criminals. So that would go with what is sometimes typical of sex offenders and especially child molesters. And I also think that the evidence shows that there's a lot of emotional inhibitants. We see that on the Rorschach as well as just in the clinical picture, that people would be very inhibited and very easygoing, like very the opposite of when we talked at the PCLR podcast about this press conference syndrome, where people just come and present themselves as in a grandiose manner. It's quite the opposite, they're very kind of inhibited, very difficult talking about emotions. And when they typically drink alcohol, then sometimes that kind of opens up Pandora's box a little bit, I think.
So the way they manage emotions is to inhibit and not feel them, restrict them, constrain them.
Yeah.
Much more controlled than someone like borderline or antisocial or narcissistic that may be acting these things out and exploding. So
in Greenland, you manage emotions by going into nature. That is the primary source of relaxation and finding back to kind of the equilibrium of your mental state. And there was actually a quite interesting survey where people rated what is the most important thing in your life, and nature and relations to nature came above family. That's very unusual. So they are deeply connected to nature and to kind of getting there. Sorry, I'm just going to get some power on my computer here. To using that as an enormous resource for their well-being.
Well, and of course, that's a good stress management tool, but it doesn't teach you anything about interacting with people.
Not exactly.
Where you're going to get angry, you're going to get this, you're going to get that, you're going to be disappointed, you're going to be frustrated. Out in nature, chilling out. I mean, it'd be nice if all of us could just do that 100% of the time, but we can't.
Yeah.
So they don't really have.
Good point.
They don't have the tools or skills, if that's the primary way that they manage emotions, for dealing with kind of the emotions that are stimulated in interpersonal relationships.
Yeah. And that's a quite interesting schisma, because I've never before, living in Denmark, you don't get invited into people's homes the first time you meet them. But in Greenland, you do that all the time. But it still has a little bit of a superficial kind of, how would you say, quality. Not to say that they are superficial people, but they would invite you in, but they also expect you maybe not to stay for 5 hours. So they have this kind of way of being together that's short-lived, and they laugh a lot, but they don't kind of talk about things that are difficult. That's
well, now this sounds like, with the idea of only being able to handle so much social interaction, you're talking about people that are introverted.
Exactly.
Because if I go to a party, it's overwhelming and drains me. I'd rather be home kind of by myself, reading a book, doing that. So certain types, like obsessive compulsive people and people that are avoidant, we tend to prefer kind of more the quiet, nature, so to speak, can only handle so much social interaction.
And it's very, very difficult to kind of explain, because they are definitely not all the way through avoidant and introversive and just staying by themselves, because they are very social, but they are social in a different way than I would say people in Denmark, for example, are. I remember the first time we went to a social gathering and we stayed for 3 hours, and then we kind of looked at each other, my wife and me, and said, well, all the others have that's it's changed like 3 or 4 times, the other people. And that's when it dawned upon us, they don't expect you to stay that long. They want to get some new people in, and they have a cup of coffee and they say hi. And it's a totally different way of being together that has a superficiality about it, I think.
Well, I hear you using that term superficiality, but it just sounds like they have a low tolerance for the interpersonal interactions and the
Yeah,
things that are
maybe it's
stimulated.
the wrong word, but I think
Because it sounds like you haven't indicated they don't have deep connections to people.
no, they definitely do. That's not what I'm saying. So I think you're right, Carl. It might be my English. It's not that they don't have this deep relation, because they are also family people. They have their big families typically, and they spend a lot of time with their families. But it is maybe a lower tolerance for how much social interaction one can take, before you kind of get fed up.
Yeah, most of us can relate to that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so you've described their emotionality kind of in the interpersonal aspects, which presents a picture of kind of an introversive person, probably somewhat restrained with emotionality, maybe not the skills to handle all the emotional things that are stimulate in relationships all the time. How about contrasting these people to psychopathy and the grandiosity and the glibness
Yeah.
that you find in psychopathy?
Well, we talked in the other podcast about glibness not being a real big factor in Denmark. It's even less a factor in Greenland, because if there's one thing that people don't, is like kind of boost their own ego and talk a lot about themselves. They really restrain themselves in that way that you might see in other very Nordic countries or Arctic regions. So that is a point where it's very different. I think the thing that is about Greenland and this whole very, very sad, massive prevalence of sexual abuse of children. In some towns, it's every other kid that has been sexually abused. Statistics show. So we're talking about, obviously there are only 57,000 people, but if you kind of add that up and multiply that to like US standards, it would be like 50 million kids. So it is something that has kind of this vicious cycle that a lot of them themselves have been sexually abused when they were kids. So it's even more a question of breaking that vicious cycle in Greenland than maybe other places in the world.
Well, you're talking about a cycle that's developed over time. You're also describing the personality that contributes to that, Michael, and the fact that, they're kind of introversive, somewhat avoidant. They don't deal with these emotions that are in there someplace. So, and then now they have the behavioral history of often of being abused themselves, which creates a template for the future action.
And one other thing, Carl, they definitely don't talk about sex. That is a big taboo. So that is obviously something that strikes a psychologist as interesting when you work with sex offenders, and that there are so many of them. And I have an interesting kind of story that my kids were with me as with my wife, and they went to school there. And sex education is voluntary in Greenland. So the teacher decides for themselves if they want to teach sexual education. And I think in a country where we have these massive problems, it's mind blowing that they don't have like a week or two like we have in Denmark each year, starting from very early on, where you teach people about procreation and sex and borders and when do you start having sex, and that is just mind blowing to me.
They don't really have a venue for talking about these intimate kind of important issues. You're describing someone that would be completely bottled up without any recourse for talking about maybe what's troubling them. So then you've got this behavioral template of this carrying over generations, Michael. Well, now you've described the person. Well, why does the behavior happen, or how does it, what's the typical example of how this might for an
I think
individual?
I think it's $1 million question. I don't pretend to have the full answer, but I think there is a combination of being inhibited and having trouble relating to your own emotions, combined with maybe not tolerating alcohol as well as other populations. You see that in other kind of Inuit populations, and they don't drink more than in Denmark. They actually drink less in Greenland per capita. But the way they drink alcohol and sometimes the way they react to it is more problematic, and they suddenly become very I wouldn't say aggressive necessarily, but that's one thing with the violent offenders, but they become less inhibited very quickly.
So the alcohol impairs this over controlledness in them.
Yeah,
And everything that's in there that's not been expressed, dealt with, then that comes out. And then
that's
they have,
my theory. Yeah, and I think if I working 20 years in forensics, I don't think I've ever seen kind of what you would call a low hanging fruit that if you could just pick that would fix everything. But the closest I come is definitely if you could stop the alcohol problem in Greenland, you would really see a lot less crime. There's
interesting.
no doubt about that. And everybody knows that. Everybody talks about it. And they have different regulations, kind of like Sweden, where there are only certain places you can buy the alcohol and stuff. But it's not, it's a difficult thing because, it's still also a free country. You want people to be able to manage their own lives. So that's a problem.
Well, that's a big task in retraining people. You control the alcohol, that's the one thing, but then retraining people to be able to have better stress management skills, interpersonal skills, being able to talk about things, being able to express their emotions, being able to
Mm.
process things internally in such a restrained, constricted individual is really a tough nut to crack.
I think it is. And I think also I think now they have maybe around 36 or 38 licensed psychologists in the country, and that's a lot compared to when I started working there 20 years ago, and only a fraction of those actually speak Greenlandic. So you need to work with interpreters and stuff, and you live, as you know, it's the biggest island in the world. It's a massive place, and people live all over this island. And sometimes, the psychologists are obviously concentrated in the capital and the larger towns, so the access is not even there, even if you wanted to, maybe.
And these psychologists then aren't from Greenland for the most part.
Well, so it's getting better and better. I think maybe let's say half now would be Greenlandic speaking. Sometimes a lot of the history between Denmark and Greenland is so complex that people are often kind of half Danish, half Greenlandic. So some would be that, and some would be maybe what you would say pure Greenlandic. And they study in Denmark. They have access to free universities in Denmark, so they would all be educated in Copenhagen or Aarhus in Denmark. But they would be more and more coming from Greenland, which is a positive step.
Well, I kind of go back to everything when I talk about the countries over there in that area of my presentations. And I'm thinking I'd rather give a presentation to the psychologists in Copenhagen, to the ones in Stockholm. Maybe the Greenland people are too restricted. They wouldn't laugh at any of my jokes.
I don't know, Carl. I mean, they definitely have a sense of humor, but it's very different from the Danish one. They're not big on irony and sarcasm, which I find extremely
Yeah,
amusing personally. But so you have to really be be concerned with being ironic when you're in Greenland.
I think if I ever go back to talk again in this lifetime, I'm only going back to Denmark.
But
I,
I mean, I have to say, just for the record, I have some amazing Greenlandic friends, and people are so friendly and they're so welcoming. I mean, it is a more welcoming society than Denmark, for example, is. I gotta say that. But at the same time, below the surface, there are all these massive problems that you just cannot deny. That's a big.
an anxious, depressive kind of personality that's restricted often have very deep detachments. You think about obsessive compulsive people or avoidant people.
Mm,
So they may have deeper attachments than a lot of the cluster B types.
yeah.
So
And I'm
underneath,
gonna go with a lot of avoidance. I think that is pretty much describes what we're talking about here. That they and that kind of it kind of goes into the whole way they kind of attend to life in general is a bit avoidant sometimes, just not dealing with issues, pretending they're not there in a sense.
Well, then you move from there, and now you've described the people very clearly, Michael. So what's involved in the treatment?
Yeah, well, the treatment is a little bit less of, focused on necessarily their sexuality, but more on kind of life skill treatment and also emotional problems, talking about just rehearsing, sorry, training to be more in contact with your emotions. So it's more of a genuine psychotherapy than it's necessarily focused around the paraphilia or the sexual offending, but also kind of tying links, of course, to why would that behavior have happened. So it's early days. It started in 2022, I think, or 21. I joined the program in 22. So I mean, in 10 years or 15 years, it's going to be so interesting to evaluate, to see if can you get this recidivism down. That's going to be very interesting.
It sounds real logical the way you describe it, Michael. If you reduce the alcohol consumption and then you give people skills to deal with these things or the impetus for doing it,
Yeah.
the only thing that would be a little tougher to address is the trauma that occurred to them when they were molested themselves.
Yeah. And that's exactly my point with breaking the cycle. There are so many traumatized people that it's sometimes you can get a little discouraged trying to think how do we solve all this, but it's always kind of looking to the next generation at the same time, still focusing on this generation and thinking that we just have to do better with the next generation and getting better at also seeing these things early on. And as I said in our former podcast, that in Denmark we have a very easily discovered typically when there's something wrong with kids. I mean, in Greenland you can live in a small town of 50 people way up north and nobody will notice what's going on maybe ever. So it's a challenge, big challenge.
Well, I always thought that, in these different countries like this, particularly in those Scandinavian countries, the weather impacts people's personality considerably.
Mm.
When you go to Finland, they have a high rate of suicide, and they show up on the Rorschach with high deppies, reflections. They're a very independent kind of cultural people that have had a lot of alcohol abuse and a lot of deaths related to that.
Mm.
And it's just so cold there. I don't know how it is anymore, but in the old days when I visited, everybody has their sauna, and there's a lot of alcohol use up there.
Yeah. I think it's not unlike Greenland in the sense that it is Arctic climate. It's very cold. It's very tough, rough weather conditions. It's very dark. I mean, places in Greenland where the sun doesn't rise for 3 months, and then with the alcohol abuse, and obviously, unfortunately, also a very very high suicide rate, one of the highest in the world. So that kind of goes without saying is a massive problem as well. I remember I had a group of inmates and different professionals where we kind of talked about suicide, and everybody, not even one person didn't have a personal story to tell about suicide in some ways in the vicinity of their family, and that just kind of really was very very difficult to deal with. I think I know one person who knew one person who committed suicide, outside of the professional life, and in there it is part of reality that everybody knows someone really close that committed suicide.
If you can't process your emotions, how do you deal with grief and loss?
Yeah, it's difficult.
Probably being sexually assaulted too, as like you have to deal with the suicides, and I can see, yeah, unfortunately, yeah, the culture.
So obviously, being part of a project like this that I was extremely meaningful, because if you can break this cycle, if we can get people into treatment and kind of also help the next generation, I find it difficult to see a more meaningful job, but does it work? Time will tell. I am very optimistic about it, but at the same time, we're talking about some really massive structural problems that obviously won't go away easily. But
talking about people that you approach them because of their inhibitions, but they do have attachment capacity, and they have deep feelings in there somewhere. It's getting to them and teaching them to utilize them and process them. So, like you said, it's more like a traditional therapy in many ways.
Yeah. And I think my experience, Carl, was that a lot of them actually found some kind of I wouldn't say pleasure or anything, but just it found it nice to that somebody finally took an interest in them. I mean, a professional, a mental health professional that sat down and asked them about their lives. I was like they weren't really used to that. Of course, some people were more distancing and skeptical, but a lot were very interested and very open to that, going into that process. So that's what kind of gives you hope for.
As human beings, there's more normality in the desire for connections, connectedness. So when they're able to, there would be some relief and hope for them on that level.
Exactly. And we obviously, in the article that we are working on, we're going to have a look at comparing these offenders to what you have done, Carl, in earlier on American child molesters in a sample. So that's going to be really interesting to see what might be different there.
Well, your description lends itself to predicting Rorschach variables for contrast and comparison. So, I mean, that's very helpful. Because as we know, the Rorschach variables are directly linked to traits, and you're describing a lot of things about the personality that gives us a picture for comparison.
Yeah.
Because in our samples, most of the people, well, in our child molester sample, they're nonviolent.
Yeah.
Child molesters, so there is less antisocial personality disorder and stuff, but probably more than what you're describing.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah, there was very little in my population. Of course, some of them had violent convictions, but really not a lot of them. But there was some recidivist regarding child molesting, unfortunately. So that's, but not the violence, not the antisocial, the frauding, all these kind of things that would be more of a criminal personality.
Yes.
Well, Michael, thank you again for that. Again, that's a population that I think many people probably don't know as much about, and some of the statistics that you talked about pretty eye-opening. So, yes, thank you for describing the population, talk about the treatment, and then the hopeful of kind of where things may go. And it's good that people are taking a look at it and trying to give them some different tools to better help future generations.
And also, when speaking about the nature, it's hard to find more beautiful nature in the world. So obviously, they built a new airport in Nuuk in Greenland, and there's actually a connection from New York now. So I recommend everybody who takes an interest into just getting one of the most amazing experiences. Also, the people and the nature that you can possibly find. So.
When's the sun up? What months are those?
I recommend actually spring and autumn. Very, very
spring and autumn.
More stable weather. The summer can get very rainy. The winter can get very dark.
Yes. I would like to see the sun on that vacation. So, all right. Spring and autumn.
If you go in summer, Jason, it's all you see is the sun because it doesn't set. So.
Oh, even better.
Is there a beach there, Michael?
I went swimming every Sunday morning, but it's 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius in the winter in the fjords. So it's what we call ice bathing.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Cold plunge, a nice cold plunge for the morning. All right. Well, Michael, again, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure. So again, thank you all to our listeners and our watchers. Feel free to continue to like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, like Spotify and Apple Music, and a whole bunch of others. So we'll see you guys all next time. Thank you again, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks for having me.